In the summer of 1997, two hydrophones stationed more than 3,000 miles apart picked up the same sound at the same moment. It was louder than any recorded animal call on Earth. It lasted close to a minute. And for nearly 3 decades, nobody could say with certainty what made it. Last year, a deep-sea camera lowered into the exact region where that signal originated captured something on its final pass before the cable snapped. And according to the team reviewing the footage, whatever moved across the lens was longer than a blue whale. The sound was nicknamed the bloop. That single word became a kind of shorthand for everything the ocean still refuses to explain. To understand why a new piece of footage matters so much, you have to go back to how the bloop was detected in the first place. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy built a network of underwater microphones called SOSUS. The system was designed to track Soviet submarines, but after the Cold War ended, oceanographers were given limited access to the data. And in the late 1990s, that access led to one of the strangest acoustic discoveries in modern science. A low-frequency rumble, traced to a point in the South Pacific roughly between New Zealand and the southern tip of South America, was registered across a vast expanse of ocean. The signal rose in pitch, held, then faded out. It didn't match the pattern of a submarine. It didn't match the pattern of an earthquake. And crucially, it behaved in a way that ocean scientists associated with a living animal, at least on first analysis. For years, the prevailing explanation was marine biology. Something enormous, something uncatalogued, seemed the only reasonable answer. Internet forums ran wild. Writers pointed to H.P. Lovecraft and imagined ancient creatures buried beneath the seafloor. Serious researchers gently pushed back and suggested a biological call from an unusually large whale species, or perhaps a deep-sea animal science had yet to document. Then, in 2012, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration released a new analysis. They compared the bloop's acoustic signature with recordings of icequakes, specifically the cracking and fracturing of massive icebergs, as they scrape across the ocean floor in Antarctica. And the match, officially, was close enough. NOAA's position became, and remains, that the bloop was almost certainly an icequake. That should have ended the story. For a lot of scientists, it did. But a smaller group of marine acousticians were never fully satisfied. They pointed to subtle features in the original recording that, in their view, the iceberg theory didn't fully account for the rise in pitch, the duration, the specific harmonic pattern. And they argued that if we ever got a camera into the precise region where the sound originated, we might find out that the iceberg answer, while plausible, was not the complete picture. That is the context for what happened during a recent research expedition. The vessel involved was operating under a joint oceanographic program studying deep-sea biodiversity in the southern Pacific. The exact coordinates of their primary drop site have not been fully released, but according to publicly available briefings, the team was working within roughly 200 nautical miles of the triangulated Bloop origin point. Their equipment included a high-pressure deep-sea camera rated for depths beyond 6,000 meters, tethered to the ship by a reinforced fiber-optic cable. The plan was straightforward. Lower the camera, record for several hours, retrieve it, analyze the footage. The first 2 descents produced exactly what you'd expect from that part of the ocean. Marine snow drifting in slow motion. A few glimpses of small bioluminescent organisms. A distant shape that one researcher identified as a sleeper shark. Nothing extraordinary. The third descent was different. According to the marine biologist who led the review of the footage and whose account has been reported in several science communication outlets, at around the 4-hour mark, the camera's motion sensor triggered a deeper recording window. Something had passed through its field of view. When the researchers reviewed the sequence frame by frame, they described a body. A long, undulating, dark-toned shape that moved laterally across the camera's cone of vision and then disappeared into the surrounding black. Their rough estimate of its length, based on the camera's known lens parameters and the reference points of particulate matter in the water column, was somewhere between 30 and 34 meters. A blue whale, for reference, averages between 24 and 30 meters. What the footage showed, in other words, was something that appeared longer than the largest animal currently recognized by science. That is the claim. It is important to be careful with it, because there are several perfectly reasonable objections that any marine biologist would raise before accepting that interpretation. Lens distortion at depth is real. Estimating scale from a single moving object. in near total darkness, with only ambient particulate matter for reference, is notoriously unreliable. The human brain is also famously bad at parsing the size of unfamiliar shapes in unfamiliar environments. A large but not impossibly large animal, moving closer to the camera than assumed, could easily appear to be much bigger than it is. And there's another problem. The cable snapped. Whatever the cause, the tether broke before the camera could be recovered. The footage exists because it was streaming in real time, which means the highest resolution version was never retrieved. What researchers are working with is a compressed stream. And compressed streams lose detail in precisely the kind of low-light, high-motion scenes where detail matters most. So when you hear the claim that a deep-sea camera captured the source of the bloop and that it's bigger than a blue whale, the honest version is more nuanced. A camera in the general vicinity of the bloop's origin recorded a sequence that, according to one team's analysis, shows an animal of extraordinary size. The interpretation is disputed. A scale estimate is rough. And the connection to the bloop specifically remains speculative. But the conversation the footage has reopened is worth taking seriously. Because marine biologists have been telling us for years that the deep ocean is almost entirely unmapped. According to NOAA's own figures, more than 80% of the world's oceans remain unexplored in any systematic way. We have better surface maps of Mars than we do of our own seabed. And within that unmapped expanse, new species are discovered constantly. A new deep-sea shark, a new jellyfish, a new genus of cephalopod with body structures that challenge existing taxonomic categories. Every year without fail. The idea that something very large and currently unknown might live in the southern Pacific is not, by itself, outlandish. It is a reasonable prediction of what happens when you combine an enormous, unexplored habitat with a persistent acoustic anomaly. What researchers push back on fairly is the leap from that prediction to any specific identification. A long, dark, undulating shape caught for a few seconds on a compressed video stream is not enough to name a species. It is not enough to overturn the icequake hypothesis. It is, at most, a reason to return to the same coordinates with better equipment and more time. And that's exactly what a coalition of researchers is reportedly now proposing. The tentative plan, as outlined in briefings to ocean science foundations, involves a sustained deployment of autonomous deep-sea vehicles in the region. Unlike a tethered camera, these vehicles can operate independently for days, mapping acoustic sources and cross-referencing them with visual data. If there is something biological generating low-frequency signals in that part of the ocean, a long enough deployment has a reasonable chance of documenting it. If the original bloop was an icequake, as NOAA concluded, the same equipment should be able to confirm that too by detecting the characteristic signatures of ice scraping against the seafloor. Either answer would be valuable. That is what good science looks like. You set up an experiment where either result teaches you something real. It's also worth pausing on why this particular mystery has stayed alive for so long. The bloop was not just a strange sound. It was a strange sound that emerged from a part of the planet almost no human has ever visited. Its power alone, the sheer volume at which it was transmitted across thousands of miles of water, felt like a message from somewhere deeper than our instruments could normally reach. And when you tell people that the ocean is mostly unmapped, and then you play them a recording of the loudest animal-like sound ever captured, the imagination does the rest. There's a reason the bloop became a cultural object as much as a scientific one. It sits at the intersection of two very human feelings. The first is curiosity about what's out there. The second is the quiet suspicion that the world we've charted is smaller than the world that actually exists. Skeptics will note, correctly, that the most extraordinary claims require the most ordinary mistakes to be ruled out first. Lens artifact, depth pressure distortion on the camera housing, misidentification of particulate plumes as body segments. All of these are possibilities, and any serious marine research team would test each of them before going public with a creature-sized conclusion. The fact that the footage is being described cautiously with phrases like appears, to show and consistent with, rather than definitively, is actually a sign that the scientists involved understand what they are looking at, and what they are not yet looking at. At the same time, a blanket dismissal feels equally unearned. The icequake explanation, while plausible, was always a statistical best fit rather than a confirmed identification. A piece of visual evidence from the source region, however imperfect, is the kind of data that moves a question forward rather than closes it. If the returning expedition confirms an iceberg source, we will have finally put a long-running mystery to rest. If it documents an unknown megafauna species, marine biology will need to update some of its assumptions about what the deep ocean can support. Either outcome is, in its own way, a significant result. For now, the Bloop sits where it has always sat, on the edge of what we know, a sound without a confirmed face, a region without a clear map, and a single ambiguous piece of footage that raises more questions than it answers. Maybe the next descent will tell us something definitive. Maybe it won't. Maybe the answer will arrive quietly in a peer-reviewed paper that gets less attention than the mystery ever did. That is often how these things go. It helps, when thinking about this, to remember how recent our sense of the deep ocean actually is. The abyssal plain, the stretch of seafloor that covers most of the planet's surface below 4,000 meters, was considered biologically empty well into the 20th century. Scientists assumed nothing could survive the pressure, the cold, the permanent dark. Then in the 1960s and 1970s, deep submersible expeditions began documenting communities of organisms thriving around hydrothermal vents. Tube worms the length of a car. Crabs clustered on chimneys of mineral-rich water. An entire biosphere powered by chemosynthesis rather than sunlight. None of that was predicted. All of it was confirmed within a single human lifetime. Against that backdrop, the idea that additional large organisms might exist at depths we rarely visit is not extraordinary. It is the default expectation, given how much ocean there still is to look at. What would be extraordinary is if we had already found everything. There's also a practical dimension to this conversation that often gets lost. Deep-sea research is expensive. A single expedition to the Southern Pacific, equipped to conduct the kind of sustained monitoring that would definitively test the Bloop source question, costs millions of dollars and requires coordination across multiple institutions. Funding for this kind of work comes and goes. Priorities shift. A mystery that fascinates the public does not always translate into sustained investment, and the gap between what we could learn and what we actually get around to learning is, frankly, wide. The attention generated by a piece of ambiguous footage in that sense has real scientific value. It pushes a dormant question back into active consideration. It brings funding conversations to the surface. It creates pressure, however mild, for more careful follow-up. None of that makes the footage itself more accurate. But it does help explain why researchers who approach the material carefully are nevertheless willing to talk about it publicly. They understand that a cautious description of a suggestive frame sequence is often the only way to keep a question alive long enough for it to be properly answered. What's undeniable is that the ocean, after all this time, still hasn't run out of things to surprise us with. Every descent into the dark pulls back a little more of the curtain. And sometimes, very rarely, it lets us glimpse something that doesn't quite fit the map we thought we were standing on. If you find yourself thinking about that final minute of footage, the long undulating shape moving through the beam of a camera 3 miles down, you're not alone. A lot of researchers have been thinking about it too. The question isn't whether the ocean still holds secrets, that much is settled. The question is how big those secrets can actually be, and whether the one we heard in 1997 is finally ready to show us its face. The next time a research ship heads south with better equipment and more time, we may finally find out. Or we may simply add another footnote to a mystery that has outlasted several generations of marine biologists already. Either way, the sound is still on the record. The footage is still being studied. And the part of the ocean where both of them came from is still, in every meaningful sense, a place we have barely started to understand. For a lot of people, that uncertainty is unsatisfying. We want answers. We want a name for the thing in the water. The careful work of science rarely moves at that speed, and it rarely delivers answers on the schedule we would prefer. But the work continues, expedition by expedition, frame by frame, acoustic signal by acoustic signal. And the map very slowly gets filled in, one dark stretch at a time. Whatever the source of the bloop turns out to be, the real lesson of the footage is probably something quieter. That our planet is still capable of surprising us. That the instruments we build reveal things we weren't expecting to find. And that the edge of the known, for all our satellites and sensors and submersibles, is closer than we tend to imagine. Sometimes it's 3 miles directly beneath us. And sometimes on a grainy stream pulled from a depth where almost nothing human has ever been. It moves briefly across a camera lens and disappears again, leaving behind just enough of an impression to make us wonder. It's worth sitting with a few other dimensions of this story that tend to be overlooked in the rush to interpret a single piece of footage. One is the history of other large, poorly understood deep-sea creatures that scientists eventually did confirm, sometimes after decades of rumor and dismissal. The giant squid is the obvious example. For centuries, sailors returned from long voyages with stories of enormous tentacled animals attacking ships at sea. Natural historians, as a general rule, did not take these stories seriously. The creature was considered a product of exaggeration until physical specimens began washing ashore in the 19th century. And it was not observed alive in its natural habitat until 2004, when a Japanese research team captured the first photographs of a living giant squid at depth. That same trajectory has played out repeatedly. The megamouth shark, a filter-feeding species more than 5 meters long, was not even known to science until 1976. When a specimen became entangled in a research vessel's sea anchor off the coast of Hawaii. Before that, no marine biologist had any record of its existence. Coelacanths, fish presumed extinct for 65 million years, turned up alive in a fisherman's net off South Africa in 1938. Each of these discoveries suggests that the phrase, "not yet documented," is not the same as "does not exist." Another dimension worth considering is how sound behaves in the ocean in ways that are counterintuitive to surface-based intuitions. Low-frequency sound can travel for thousands of kilometers through the deep sound channel, a layer of ocean water at moderate depth where acoustic signals are bent and concentrated in ways that extend their range far beyond what would be possible in air. The loudness of the bloop, which initially seemed to suggest an enormous sound source, could also be partially explained by favorable propagation conditions along the sound channel. A smaller but still substantial source, generating its signal in exactly the right location, might produce a recording that seems disproportionately powerful at distant hydrophones. This does not resolve the mystery, but it does moderate some of the more extreme interpretations of the original recording. A third dimension is the interaction between climate change and deep ocean ecosystems. As ocean temperatures shift, currents reorganize, and ice shelves calve. At different rates, the acoustic landscape of the deep sea is changing in measurable ways. Sounds that would have been normal a generation ago are now being recorded in different patterns. Sounds that might be novel to our current monitoring are being produced with possibly different frequencies than they had in the past. The implication is that the pool of deep ocean acoustic phenomena we need to explain is not fixed. It is an active, evolving set of signals that reflects an ocean that is itself actively changing. Taken together, these factors suggest humility is the right posture. The bloop happened in a specific environment, at a specific time, in a specific ocean that was already different from the ocean we are now trying to study. Our ability to reproduce the exact conditions that generated it, whether biological or geological, is itself uncertain. The ambiguity we are left with is not a failure of science. It is an honest reflection of the limits of what we can reconstruct from acoustic traces that are now decades old. None of this resolves whether a camera briefly captured something living, something enormous, something that might account for a 30-year-old signal. But it does frame the question in a way that feels honest. We are looking for an answer to something that occurred in a place we cannot easily reach, recorded by instruments that were not designed for biology, interpreted by successive teams of researchers whose tools and assumptions have shifted over time. Under those conditions, definitive conclusions are rare. Careful, patient inquiry is what actually advances understanding. Whatever the next chapter of this story turns out to be, it will probably not arrive as a single dramatic revelation. It will arrive as a quiet convergence of evidence, gathered across multiple expeditions, analyzed by multiple teams, published in a series of technical papers that gradually narrow the range of possibilities. That is how most marine biology mysteries get resolved. Slowly, through patience, through repeated observation, and through the accumulation of enough good data to make the least unlikely explanations stand out clearly from the alternatives. We are not there yet. We may never get there. But we are closer than we were, and the next expedition may bring us closer still,